All right, guys, so I'm here with Bill Reagle from CNR Insurance. Bill, thank you for joining us today. You actually have an illustrious history. You went to University of Pennsylvania at Edinburgh and got your bachelor's in communications, and then jumped right into insurance with Erie. Is that right?
So a Bachelor of Arts in Communications. Was thinking during college that wanted to jump into marketing or human resources with a big company like a Ford or a Pepsi and so on and so forth. But like so many people do, I kind of just found myself in insurance.
Hey, that's awesome. And I wrote down here, it looks like that you worked for a small agency after insurance. You worked with Erie for a couple of years on claims. Then you jumped to general insurance with a small company and worked with them for a little bit of while. And then you started your own firm.
Yep. So right out of college, I won't tell the story, it's too long, but I ended up accepting a position for a local insurance company. I worked in claims. I was an adjuster for a couple years, and I realized that, my goodness, why didn't I ever give much consideration to the industry that my father spent 36 years in and my two brothers ahead of me went into. I really thought that I would never go that direction because of all that, and I just always did things a little bit differently. But anyhow, once I had exposure to that, I really said this industry is wonderful. I love how it helps people. I love the integrity of this particular company. But I don't think claims is where I want to spend the future.
Yeah.
I really like what these agents do. I was adjusting, claims for about 7 different agencies. I got to know these folks very, very well, and I got to see their inner workings, and it just seemed glamorous. So I took some classes. I studied towards that. I told my mentor at the insurance company, this is really what I want to do in the industry.
Sure.
And one day, one of the agents that I was adjusting claims for said, hey, you ever thought about selling? And I said, my gosh, every day. So we got together. I ended up going to work for them. This was an independent insurance agency over in Beltsville. I spent about 9 years there as a sub-producer. So I was really just writing accounts. I was writing commercial accounts. I was calling 3x5 business cards and just dialing for dollars with another colleague of mine at a very young age of 23. But anyhow, it was a great experience. It was a great agency. I met my current business partner at that time. We had everything in common. We were both, single guys newer into the insurance industry. We both lived in Annapolis, and we became friends. We learned about this agency in Annapolis that was the owners wanted to sell and go do something different.
Sure.
So we came on board, and I got a hold of my current boss over there in the Beltsville area and said, hey, we want to bring this all together, these two agencies. So we did it, and in 2001 we formed this agency called CNR Insurance. We grew it organically up until 2012. We had a pretty big acquisition of a Burtonsville firm in 2012.
Oh, wow.
And back in 2016, we had another acquisition. And most recently in 2019, we had yet another one. So we now have offices in Annapolis and Laurel.
Dude, that's awesome, man. Growing fast. So it seems like you grew up really in the industry, and you thought you were going to move out of it, and you just found yourself right in it. And 20, 30 odd years later, here you are, and the company has grown. You're buying up smaller groups, and must feel good.
It feels good, and I'm just glad that I found the industry, because I was looking beyond it because of the reasons that I told you. But it really is a great business. We make people happy, including myself, all the time when I'm having conversations. And you set up the coverage, and you hope they never need it. But if they do need it and it's there, it's pretty darn rewarding.
Sure. Well, you mentioned, so you set up the coverage if they need it. You hope they don't need it, but if it's there, it's rewarding. Before, earlier we were talking about a couple of instances where, we're in Maryland, right? And you have some hurricanes, you have some tropical storms, and on the other side of the world, praying for Australia for what's happening with this fire. So there's pretty serious things that can happen along just as likely as small little things. Can you tell me about an instance where there was a big, big instance where there was a big claim, and can you tell me a little bit about something that really stood out that you learned from over the years, or that you were proud that you set up the policy the right way?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the hurricanes and natural events. So, we're not immune to hurricanes, certainly in this area. Isabel probably being the most notable, September of 2001. That was a big one. I mean, I think we had 13-foot storm surges. And I remember those in the know stating that if all the stars aligned, we could have had something in an over 20-foot watermark line. So you go downtown Annapolis and you can still see lines on walls of some places.
Yeah.
So, flood insurance is pretty darn important. For the longest time, it was only available through the National Flood Insurance Program. Now there are some private markets offering the coverage, so that's interesting. But also sometimes it kind of marries or intertwines with even like a sewer and drain backup. When that sort of event happens, water can come in and cause problems in a number of different ways. So if you're a building owner and you've got property at risk, those are two coverages that you should look at hand in hand. Really, a flood policy, and perhaps even an excess flood policy, and proper amounts of sewer and drain coverage.
So you mentioned a couple of things there. So, I mean, and those are three specific types of policies that cover three completely different things. You'd think as a building owner, you might be like, all right, well, if there's water in my basement, it doesn't really matter the reason, I've got coverage for it. But you just mentioned three separate things that might occur. It might be flood insurance, it might be water sewer backup, and you mentioned the third. I apologize. What was the third one?
It'd just be excess flood.
Sure,
So
flood.
oftentimes on the primary, it's the same thing as the primary, but usually you can only get X amount on the primary, and if you need more, want more, then you have to go to an excess market.
Sure. So, I mean, knowing that you've got to be prepared if you're in an area that's susceptible to a hurricane or susceptible. I mean, and water sewer backup can happen anywhere there's public water sewer, right? Or probably even with septic. So that's awesome. And you had told me about another instance that you were mentioning earlier with a fire. Is that right?
Fire, obviously, it's huge peril. The basic insurance policy on properties started years ago with just the peril of fire. So that's the one that everybody worries about primarily, and they do happen. I can't cite this as a current record, but your likelihood is 1 in 473 years. It's going to happen to you.
Wow, 1 in 473.
So actually, if you put $1 million on the line and you said, hey, would you play these odds at 1 in 473? I think I'd have a pretty good chance. So fires do occur. Just as a matter of fact, less than 2 weeks ago, we had a pretty significant fire on the personal line side of the house, just a home fire, nothing more than a pinched cord. So they do happen, and it doesn't take long for fires to really get out of control. So when you're looking at buildings, when you own a building, when you are looking to develop land and build something, the construction, whether it's frame or brick or steel or stick, that, but it all makes a difference.
In the policy they're writing. I mean, each one of those will have a different policy associated with it?
Not so much a different policy, just the way it'll affect your rating.
Your underwriting.
Generally speaking, you'll pay a little bit more for a frame constructed building than you would a brick or masonry.
Just because of the less chance of hazards that are affecting it?
It'll go up faster. Than a brick would. It'll sustain more damage, just like the peril of earthquake. I've heard it said before that, and it's just the opposite, really. If it's a frame built building, it's there's more give and sway. If it's brick, it's brittle and it's cracking, and it's there are those that believe that if I've got a masonry building, I want to carry earthquake coverage. And a lot of people laugh. They know, hey, we're not in California. We don't need earthquake coverage,
right.
But Google Maryland seismic activity, and you will see, just a long pages and pages of history going back over a century.
Sure.
There's a lot of things that you never even hear about, but most notably right here across the street in 2012, August of 2012, I think it was, the earthquake that hit this area.
Yeah.
I felt it like so many others did. I don't know whether you did or not.
4.8 or something?
Yeah.
I was actually outside of my driveway with my sister, and when we felt it, and we were just like, oh my gosh, what do we do?
It was surreal. It was a very strange feeling, but there were some buildings that were damaged from that. No claims that we had. We heard about from prospects afterwards. Hey, I did have some damage during that hurricane event, and I probably saw it most recently on a residential inspection of a house, but just witnessed the chimney, and he pointed it out. He said, "Yep, that happened during an earthquake." So it's something to consider. It's not often talked about, the earthquake coverage, but if I had a commercial building, especially worth a lot, I think that, and not every carrier is going to offer it either. Many do, but some don't.
Yeah.
So.
Well, earlier when we were talking, you mentioned, pull out your policy, dive into it, and see what coverages you have, see what limitations. Talk with the agent that's representing you. If I'm owning a building, and let's say in Maryland, right? We're here in Maryland, and so that's easy. And I believe, do you own this building? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you own this building, and so I'm sure that you put coverages on this building that you would recommend to anybody else. Can you talk to me a little bit about the coverages that you put on this building and why?
Sure, yeah. So it's a business owner's policy, and it's just a generic term, but it gets you a lot of bang for your buck, and if you qualify for it, it's a good way to go. Some businesses don't, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because a commercial package policy or a general liability or commercial property or whatever the case may be, your agent can guide you on that. But a business owner's policy is kind of, I heard somebody refer to it this morning, as kind of like the Happy Meal. It gives you a little bit of everything, and then you can kind of expand upon it. So I would recommend, and what you're referring to is, you're with a good company, that, the proposal that you signed up for has a lot of bells and whistles. Talk to your agent often, by the way. I mean, requests may be dependent, but meet often and have conversations, because things change, coverages change. But say, with this carrier, I like this carrier a lot. I like a lot of the coverages that we have right now, but what else is available?
Sure.
What other coverages? And you know what? Ask that of me. I'll bring you out a list from A to Z, and it might be 5 pages long. And 90% of the names of the coverages or endorsements, you're going to kind of have an idea of where they're going with it. And if there's anything, that piques your interest in any way, then we dive down and we get out the form and we kind of look at it. But if you truly want to customize policy, and there are some things specific to a building, ordinance or law is important. So this building this is a Sears and Roebuck kid home built circa 1910, and it was built according to Annapolis code back in 1910. But if something happens today, things are different.
Right.
So you can't just bank on replacement costs. There could be increased demolition or increased construction costs to comply with city or county code here. So, we have that. I think that's an important coverage. They might say, 100% of the building has to be sprinklered. They might say it's too close to the street now. It needs to be moved back. They might say you need, better ramps, better bathrooms to comply with ADA standards, and so on and so forth. So all these things are above and beyond replacement costs of same like, kind, and quality. Also, if you find yourself in an urban area, debris removal kind of is a big deal. Most of the policies give you a throw-in on it, maybe 5 or 10%. But if you're in, DC or even Baltimore, and you're right down in the thick of things, and streets need to be closed, and it's just gonna be difficult to haul away the debris. It's going to be expensive. You're not going to want to have anybody come in there without charging you an arm and a leg. Consider increasing your debris removal coverage on your policy.
Awesome. So you talked about this building specifically. You said it was an older building, and you said as you're looking through the policy, you have a business owner policy, which kind of it's like a Happy Meal. It includes everything, but you had a few specific add-ons for this building, because you said it was built in 1910, and the code for the city in 1910 is different than the code now. Mm-hmm. So if something happens, now that is completely different than the code, mm-hmm. you might have something that's completely different in replacement costs. I mean, it might have cost XYZ to build this building in 1910, and you can even prorate it to today's dollars, but now, if you rebuilt it, you might have to add in sprinklers. You might have to move the building back from the street. If you're in an urban area, you might have to have dumpsters out there that cost a lot more because you have to close down a street, bring in crews. That's huge. So if I'm a building owner, I should be thinking about, if I have an old building specifically, do I have add-ons that cover these extra costs that could potentially be there? Do I have add-ons for, am I up to code? When's the last time I reviewed my policy with my agent? And if the worst happened to my building, would my insurance cover every single aspect? I mean, the worst thing could happen is your building burns down and then you find out you're undercovered by 20%.
Yeah, it is the worst thing that can happen. It's the worst time to figure out
Yeah.
that, because there's nothing you can do about it then, because you can't buy it afterwards, unfortunately. But the ordinance and law is a big deal, especially if you're talking about an older building. Most policies today will give you a throw-in amount of maybe 5 or 10%.
Sure.
But oftentimes it's not nearly enough. So you can buy 25, 50, even 100% of the dwelling amount, or the building amount rather, ordinance or law. So I would say that would be a key one. Consider debris removal, additional debris removal.
Right.
Like, they'll give you a little bit as a throw-in. And by the way, you mentioned earlier, and I just want to be on the record to say there is no insurance policy that will cover everything. They just don't. They cover a lot,
Right.
but there's exclusions in every single policy.
Sure.
Another thing that I want to mention is, on a policy that insures a building, most of them will have special perils nowadays, or comprehensive perils, but it amazes me that I still see some that have named peril coverage. So named peril are just 17 things that are named, and if one of those 17 things happens, for example, there's coverage, but anything else there isn't.
Sure.
Contrast that with a special or a comprehensive perils form, and it says we'll cover anything. We'll cover any loss unless it's excluded by the policy.
Right.
And usually the exclusions are the big ones that are potentially too catastrophic, like earthquake or flooding or war or something like that.
Sure.
So they're really broad policies, but they don't do everything. And then to further define it on things that maybe are more susceptible to loss, for example, maybe money and securities, for example, or valuable papers, they'll put inside limits in the policy. They'll say, we won't give you right up to the building amount, we won't give you up to the business personal property amount, but we will give you a small little amount for these things, because we realize most businesses or buildings contain these things, have them. But there are usually endorsements where you can buy more.
Awesome. And I know, because we've talked in the past, but you mentioned something along the lines of, if you have tenants and something happens to those tenants, what your policy would be. So if I'm a building owner and I have multiple tenants in a building, and I'm requiring them to get insurance, and I have insurance, hopefully nothing happens. But if something happens, is there something I should be writing in my leases with my tenants, or is there some type of process that I should make sure that they follow so that they can exercise their claim properly and make sure that all the processes are followed, or if I can exercise my claim properly? I mean, is there something that I should be thinking about as a building owner, requiring my tenants to do X, Y, Z in the event of something unfortunate that would bring up insurance? Is there something I should be working with them to make sure they have that, or is something I should require right in the lease?
So, I would never play attorney. I'm not an attorney.
Sure.
I don't write a lease. I've seen a lot of leases. I've seen leases that, our insureds have sent us over, requirements that, landlords were asking tenants to comply with. And a lot of times, additional insured is a great thing to do. If you own the building and you have a tenant, you want to ask that tenant go out and get insurance, property and liability, and also get clear on, improvements and betterments inside the suite. Whose responsibility is that, the tenants or the landlords? But that additional insured thing basically means that, hey, I'm a card shop in a strip plaza, and someone walks in and trips and falls because I just mopped the floor. And, it's a sue happy society, right? So they're suing me, the card store. They're suing, they're looking up who owns that property and suing them. And they're suing the property management company. Everybody's getting sued, right? So when you as a landlord are listed additionally insured on that tenant's policy, and that situation just occurred, it means that you can call that insurance company of the tenant and say, hey, I own the building where your insured is located. This just happened. I'm getting sued. I would like you to defend me.
Sure.
In this situation. So when you have that additional insured language, that's what that means. It's a great thing. It's probably the number one thing that a landlord can do with a tenant. There's also other language that we see that their attorney may or may not recommend, things like primary, non-contrib, waiver of subrogation, so on and so forth. But back to those improvements and betterments, you could have a tenant that signs a 5-year or a 10-year lease, and maybe they come into a vanilla shell, and maybe they build it out. They put some interior walls, they build some offices, they build a bathroom, they do this, they do that. Just get clear on who's insuring what. Is it the landlord or is it the tenant? And just, make if it is the tenant, kind of make sure that they've done what they need to do if you're requiring that through the lease.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's incredible. There's already a lot of really great stuff here. I guess the final question I would have is, what about if you're listed as an additional insured and, a pipe breaks in your tenant's space and it's related to the building and it affects the tenant's space. You have insurance for the building, they have insurance for the space, you're listed as additionally insured. Is there, a specific process that you would want your tenants to go through to make sure the claim is handled properly? Or usually is something like that pretty straightforward? If I'm a landlord, how would I want to protect myself against a pipe breaking and damaging a tenant stuff to ensure that everything is handled with the claim properly?
Well, additional insured is really from a liability standpoint, not so much a property. So that wouldn't invoke the additional insured language. It would be more like a bodily injury or property damage liability situation. But I would say you would just want to monitor that. I mean, you would kind of want to be all over that tenant. Like, have you called your insurance company?
Sure.
Get your property management company involved. And if you don't see any progress soon enough or anything like that, you can always report it to your own insurance company as the landlord. You can get them involved. They can get in there, investigate it, figure out all the facts. And then if they feel the tenant was responsible, kind of go through a process called subrogation where, hey, we paid for these damages, but we think that you're at fault. So, kindly reimburse us. And they can or they can't. And if they don't, maybe it'll go beyond that to arbitration, and that would usually be it. But yeah, so I would say to answer your question, the landlord has the option. If it were me, I try to push that tenant first. Hey, call the insurance, make sure they're on this.
Sure.
But if that wasn't happen quickly enough, I would involve my own insurance and get them to.
And you as the landlord, would you recommend, and obviously you're not a lawyer, so you can't make any legal recommendations, and that's okay. But would you, if something happened like a pipe breaking, and the tenant calls you saying a pipe burst and there's water everywhere, would you recommend to a landlord to go fix it, document the process, and then have the tenant work with their insurance agency with all the documentation? Or would you recommend them calling their insurance, having their insurance come out and document it themselves? How would you recommend, if a pipe breaks, should it be fixed right away or should you wait? Who should fix it, even if it's tenant's responsibility?
Get on it quick because water is not the major thing. It's the time and water that's the major thing. So the quicker that you can get on it, get a restoration company out there, and they'll charge an arm and a leg. They do. They're emergency services. They have the big fans and they'll take the stuff up, but they will limit damage. So get them out there. The water, smoke, fire restoration services, somebody's got to call them. If the tenant isn't doing it quick enough, I think the landlord would need to step up and do it because ultimately it's going to make that claim be less.
Sure.
But
would it fall back on the landlord if the tenant didn't take steps in a commercially reasonable amount of time?
It depends on a lot of things. It depends on why it happened and who was responsible for maintaining.
That's when you get into too much minutia details.
It really, I hate that it depends, but it would depend. I mean, I would think just at face value, a pipe breaking in a building, the tenant is going to be responsible for their improvements and betterments. A tenant is going to be responsible for their business, personal property.
Right.
But it may be on the landlord to fix it, but maybe not.
Sure.
Per the lease. So I would think that both entities would have some skin in the game on that.
Yeah.
Maybe the landlord fixing it, but maybe the tenant taking care of the damage.
Cool. Well, as we close out here, and this has been super valuable, thank you, Bill. As we close out here, are there any final thoughts, suggestions, comments you have for somebody who might be looking to build or who might already own a commercial property? Any final things we didn't cover?
I would just say, know your insurance company, and I would say deal with a trusted advisor, one that. All right, so I'll put in a plug for the independent agent, but I just think that, like myself, they have access to so many different companies. They see how different companies operate, good times and bad times, marketing times, coming out with new products. These are all our bells and whistles, but then how they act after claims. versus like a captive or exclusive type of agent or company that just has that one offer. You don't really know that ever, right?
Sure.
And on the personal line side of the house, we'll say you can go direct. You can do that. You can buy it online if you want, but do you have an advocate?
Yeah.
Like who is there if you're not sure whether you should report that claim or not, or who do you ask advice to?
Yeah.
Not sure if I'm answering your question
No,
or not,
no,
but
perfect.
I would just make sure that I know the company that I chose to insure with, and I have a pretty darn good idea of what things might look like in a worst case scenario.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Bill.
You're welcome, Cecil.
Appreciate it. It was a great
Thank you.
conversation.